So let's start with life cycle assessment first. So here is the story. You have a car. It may have a tailpipe if you have an internal combustion engine. And of course, out of this tailpipe, you will be able to measure CO2. These CO2 emissions out of the tailpipes, this is those which are called tank-to-wheel emissions from the tank of the car to the wheels. And of course, if you have an electric car, these CO2 emissions will be zero. But that's not the end of the story, because of course the energy you use on board needs to be extracted and produced. If it's out of crude oil, you need to extract the crude oil, to refine it, to transport it to the retail station before it is in your tank. And all of this will emit CO2 emissions. But this is also the case if you use electricity. Producing electricity is likely to emit CO2 emissions. And it might also be the case if you use renewable fuels. When you process them, when you produce them, it will also emit CO2 emissions. For that, referring to the story of extracting crude oil from a well, we talk about well-to-tank emissions from the well to the tank of the car, and these are additional CO2 emissions. However, there is a particular case in this story when you use renewable fuels. When you consider renewable fuels, for example, a biofuel, when the biomass grows, it will extract CO2 from the atmosphere. And this carbon, which is taken from the atmosphere, is part of the composition of the fuel. And when you burn the fuel, it will effectively emit this carbon in the shape of CO2. So even if you are able to actually measure this CO2 from the tailpipe, this CO2 is part of the cycle, is part of a loop. We call this a recycled CO2. And from a life cycle perspective, this CO2 is neutral. It doesn't count because it enters a loop. And this is the reason why in well-to-tank emissions, you have positive emissions, but you may also have some negative emissions to take into account this loop. Is it the end of the story? Of course not. We still have to consider the manufacturer of the car you drive, and possibly, if it has a battery, the manufacturer of the battery as well. We need to consider the infrastructure. To build the infrastructure, it takes some CO2 emissions. To build the grid, to build the network of retail stations, and also you need to consider the step of recycling. And this is part of the manufacturer and infrastructure emissions, which are also positive. And so, at the end of the day, it is only when you consider the whole scope of emissions that you obtain life cycle emissions. So why does it matter? It matters because, as Dave said, from a climate perspective, it doesn't matter whether the greenhouse gases are emitted during the production of the car or of the infrastructure, during the production of the energy carrier, or at the tailpipes. The climate doesn't care about that. From a climate perspective, only life cycle emissions matter. And now, what is challenging about life cycle assessment? Why isn't it taken into account already today? It's challenging because you can't actually measure the well-to-tank emissions, and you can't easily measure the manufacturer and infrastructure emissions. And consequently, it's hard to measure life cycle emissions. On the contrary, the tailpipe emissions, tank-to-wheel, can easily be measured, and it might be the reason why they are already regulated today, while it's not the case for the other emissions. However, the other emissions, if they can't be measured, they can be evaluated. However, evaluation means that you need to have data, you need to make assumptions, you need to draft scenarios, you need to draft use cases, etc. And that's difficult. So let's try to summarize it. If I want to assess life cycle CO2 emissions, I have to make decisions on which electricity I use, which fuel, which vehicle's powertrain, which use case, and what about the manufacturer. For electricity, you have several options. It can be made out of fossil fuels, such as coal, such as natural gas, or out of low-carbon sources, such as nuclear electricity, solar panels, or windmills. For fuels, you also have several options. It can be out of crude oil, or it can be a renewable fuel. For the vehicle's powertrain, you can use an internal combustion engine, or you can have an electric car, or you can have a mix of those. It can be a hybrid car, or it can be a plug-in hybrid car. For the use cases, there are plenty of options. It will depend on your trips. Are you an urban driver doing rather short distances, or someone driving long distances on the highway? Do you drive in a cold climate or in a warm climate? The energy consumption will depend on that. And if you have a plug-in hybrid car, how often do you recharge it? And regarding the manufacturer, it will depend on how it is produced, in which country, depending on the electricity, but it will also depend on the configuration of your car and the size of the battery, more particularly. What is difficult is that there are many options, but of course you can combine any of the options with the other ones. And the number of possible combinations is almost countless, it's almost infinite. And therefore, when you try to agree on what is the base case and what are the relevant data to be used and what are the relevant sensitivities to be run, it's very hard to reach an agreement. And so this is a particular challenging aspect of life cycle assessment, that you have so many options, so many possible combinations, that it is very hard to understand what you are talking about.